Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining our webinar on developing a reporting taxonomy for the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. My name is Ravi and I'll be taking you through the first section of this webinar. There should be some very small text at the bottom left of your screen, and that's to point out that the views expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and not necessarily those of the IFRS Foundation, the International Accounting Standards Board, or the International Sustainability Standards Board. Before I take you through today's agenda, I think it's important to clarify that when we refer to digital reporting, we refer to digital general purpose financial reporting, which encapsulates both reporting of financial statements and sustainability related financial information. So let's begin. In today's webinar, we will be discussing the IFRS Foundation's focus and approach to digital reporting, what digital reporting is, and why it has become increasingly important in a data-driven world. We will then talk about the staff draft of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy and the related request for feedback, and how to get involved in the development of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy, the next steps in its development, and to take any questions from the audience. And if you do have any questions during the webinar, please include them in the chat functionality and we will address them all at the very end. Now over to slide 3, please. The IFRS Foundation was created in 2001 to develop globally accepted accountancy standards. Those standards, the IFRS accounting standards, are now mandated in over 140 jurisdictions and is now the de facto global accounting language. The Foundation has a 3-tier governance model. The boards, being both the IASB and the ISSB, are responsible for setting and maintaining the IFRS standards. The trustees are responsible for strategy and oversight of the standard setting boards and are accountable to a monitoring board of capital market authorities responsible for corporate reporting in their jurisdictions. Finally, the monitoring board are responsible for providing public accountability for the organisation. This oversight structure and established standard setting process means the IFRS Foundation is best placed to build investor-focused sustainability disclosure standards. It's important to provide context on the ISSB's focus, which is consistent with the mission of the IFRS Foundation to meet the information needs of investors. The ISSB's responsibility is to develop a global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards, a taxonomy to facilitate the digital reporting of information reported in terms of the standards. In the next section, Jatin will briefly discuss what digital reporting is, why it is important, and the role of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy in facilitating digital reporting. The IFRS taxonomies are digital taxonomies that facilitate making financial reports machine readable. They are different from green taxonomies used to classify environmental sustainable economic activities. Preparers will benefit from this global baseline of sustainability disclosure standard too by avoiding the need for multiple requirements. The ISSB standards would enable companies to provide comprehensive and comparable information about sustainability matters to the financial markets in a timely manner. Later on in the webinar, both Aida and Owen will talk in a bit about the 2 draft sustainability disclosure standards, which were published for comment earlier this year. Lastly, the standards will be developed to facilitate the addition of requirements that are jurisdiction-specific or aimed at a wider stakeholder group. For example, the European Union's planned Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, as well as initiatives in the Americas and Asia-Oceania. Similarly, the taxonomy will also be developed to facilitate jurisdictional top-up taxonomy where applicable. As mentioned a moment ago, the ISSB and the IASB sit along each other within the actual IFRS Foundation. The IASB is responsible for developing IFRS accounting standards, and via those standards, companies are required are currently required to consider climate-related matters where material when preparing their financial statements. Similarly, the ISSB is responsible for developing IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards, and like the IASB, has taken an investor-focused approach. It is important to note that the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards are intended to be compatible with the IFRS accounting standards, as well as with other generally accepted accounting principles to meet a range of investor needs. While both boards will remain independent and complementary to provide comprehensive financial information to investors and other providers of capital, both boards will collaborate closely to ensure there is connectivity and compatibility between the IFRS standards, and both boards will work in the public interest. Lastly, each board will be responsible for the development and maintenance of a taxonomy, which will facilitate the digital reporting of financial information. I'm now going to hand over to Jatin, who will briefly discuss digital reporting. Over to you.
Thanks, Ravi. My name is Jatin, and I will briefly be talking you through what digital reporting is and why it has become increasingly important in a data-driven world. To clarify, when we refer to digital reporting, we're referring to both digital general purpose financial reporting, which encapsulates both reporting of financial statements and sustainability-related financial information. Financial information is reported and available in various formats. If we take PDF documents, for example, these are often structured in a manner that is visually and contextually appealing and can easily be read by humans. However, these PDF documents are not computer readable, and this makes it difficult to extract and analyze large quantities of data or text across hundreds of entities. While PDF documents may not lend themselves to efficient data analysis, there is still a use case for these reporting formats. For example, in cases where users may want to analyze a single company's reports in detail. Digital general purpose financial reporting is the reporting of financial information in a digital format using Xbrl, which transforms PDF documents into computer readable data. The information in the static PDF documents is tagged with pieces of Xbrl code, which will be maintained in the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy. This taxonomy is a key tool in facilitating digital reporting, and we will discuss more on what this taxonomy is in the next slide. Financial information that has been tagged using the structured format lends itself to greater efficiency in analyzing large amounts of data. Once financial information has been tagged using items from the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy, this information then becomes computer readable and storable on a database, allowing users to query large amounts of information from such a database efficiently. Lastly, the introduction of the iXBRL format allows the best of both worlds by providing the visual, human-readable context of a PDF document with a computer-readable XBRL data coded into a single document. Before we talk about the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy, it's important to understand what a taxonomy is in general. A taxonomy is a system for classifying information into categories or groups and can take a variety of forms. As Ravi mentioned earlier, the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy is not a green taxonomy, but rather a system for classifying and structuring sustainability-related financial data points. The IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy contains elements which are specific defined codes representing reporting concepts and are referenced to specific disclosure requirements in the standards, where each element is ascribed a name and a description. So let's take a look at the following example. Preparers of financial reports may refer to their gross Scope 1 emissions using different terms, or indeed even in different languages. However, it's not clear when we're looking at these line items that this is what each company intends to convey. You might be able to get some context if you looked at the PDF document as a whole, but this is cumbersome and time-consuming to do for hundreds of data points. Now, if each of these preparers were to tag their financial reports using the elements from the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy, a user of that information, such as an investor, would know that each of these line items from these companies actually mean the same thing in this example, thus making these items comparable. The Xbrl element acts like a barcode in that it makes the information on the PDF document readable by a computer. The Xbrl element, or tag, also contains other useful pieces of information about the tagged items, which the preparer includes when tagging their financial reports. Owen will speak a little bit more about how the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy will be developed later on in this webinar. So, why is digital reporting important? We live in the information age, and increasingly more information is becoming available to investors, including sustainability-related financial information. By digitalizing financial reports, information in those reports becomes machine readable, allowing investors to access and analyze information more efficiently, including information in foreign languages. Digital financial reporting provides opportunities to improve capital market efficiency and potentially reduce cost of capital, as investors would be able to analyze information and make capital market decisions much quicker. Digital financial reporting can also assist regulators in their market oversight activities and enforcement reviews. And finally, 90% of companies by 90% of public companies by market capitalization are now required to undertake some form of digital financial reporting. These jurisdictions include the US, China, the European Union, Japan, the UK, India, Korea, and South Africa. And while there are challenges in the adoption of digital reporting practices, there is a clear global trend towards facilitating and implementing digital financial reporting. I will now hand over to Aida, who will talk you through the recent technical developments and the staff draft taxonomy.
Thank you so much, Jatin, and hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this session. So as Jatin said, I will give a brief overview of the staff draft of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy before I hand over to Owen to go into a little bit more detail on the staff recommendation. So moving on to the next slide, with the purpose to help ISSB facilitate digital reporting from the outset, the staff of the IFRS Foundation have developed a staff draft of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy that we are discussing today. At a later date, ISSB is going to publish a proposed taxonomy for a public consultation following the IFRS Foundation due process. So let's give a little bit background and see what is this staff draft based on. So it's very much based on proposals that are in the two ISSB exposure drafts that we can see on this slide. So the ISSB sought feedback on two proposed standards, a general requirement standards, which is IFRS S1, you can see here on the left-hand side, and the climate standard, IFRS S2 on the right-hand side. These documents, which I assume many of you have provided comment letters to, were out for consultation until end of July, and the team were very pleased to receive 1,300 comment letters, which ISSB is currently reviewing. So the draft IFRS S1 sets out overall requirements for disclosing sustainability-related financial information about all sustainability-related risks and opportunities, with the objective to provide the users with complete set of sustainability-related financial information. So these disclosures will be centered on companies' consideration of its governance, strategy, and risk management, as well as the metrics and targets that company uses to measure, monitor, and manage sustainability-related risks and opportunities. This approach is consistent with recommendations of the TCFD, but extends them to all sustainability-related risks and opportunities, not only those related to the climate. Now moving on to the S2, the draft of IFRS S2, climate-related disclosures, sets out specific requirements to identify, measure, and disclose climate-related financial information. This is also built on the TCFD recommendations and also SASB climate-related industry-based requirements. When an entity applying IFRS S1, so the left-hand side exposure draft, identifies climate-related risks as a matter to report to, then it would follow the disclosure requirements set out in IFRS S2. As I mentioned, our staff draft and staff request for feedback are very much based on the requirements that are in these two exposure drafts and follow and try to translate them to digital reporting. And this process went both ways, so that IFRS, the drafts of the S1 and S2 also consider digital reporting, in that there is a question, or there was a question in the exposure draft asking stakeholders for feedback on the drafting and any suggestions that would have an effect on digital reporting. So that feedback is also part of the feedback that the ISSB is considering now. So I'm just going to say a few words about the due process following the staff request for feedback, which is on the next slide. And it's very important to note that the ISSB is following the same high quality due process as the ISB, which is set out by the IFRS Foundation trustees. And this extends to the due process that is followed for taxonomy development. So what this means is that requirements in the standards are translated in the taxonomy by the IFRS Foundation taxonomy team, but all of this has to be approved by the ISSB to make sure that it follows the requirements on the standard and it does not interpret them. And this is done through a formal balloting process, so very similar process that the ISSB follows for publishing its standards, or that will follow for publishing the S1 and S2. And you can see that this process really starts in terms of consultation once the standards are issued. So once S1 and S2 are out, the proposed taxonomy will be developed, approved by the ISSB, published for public consultation, after which the ISSB is going to review the feedback and finalize the taxonomy. And in this whole process, we're also going to involve our specialist taxonomy consultative group to provide advice. But you can see the staff draft is actually before this process. So this is additional step we have taken to facilitate digital development of this taxonomy and its timely conclusion, given that how comprehensive topics are covered by the S1 and S2. So this is not a shortcut or replacement of the due process, but it is really additional step we are taking to facilitate digital reporting. And this is why the staff draft was published back in May and out for a comment period for a few more weeks until end of September. So let's look at the package of the documents that we have published in May in the staff request for feedback. So there's a few things we set out. First is the actual taxonomy, so the actual elements that the staff is recommending, and they are set out both in human readable and machine readable formats. But it's not only that, we accompanied it with what we call staff request for feedback document, which outlines the thinking behind the development of these elements and sets out focus on fundamental matters that we thought need to be considered and addressed early in order to develop taxonomy on a timely basis. And it is these fundamental matters that Owen will walk you through shortly. And just another caveat, I already mentioned in the due process section, but just to highlight that this document and recommendations we're discussing today are not approved by the ISSB. They are not a formal consultation document. They're not an exposure draft, but they're merely additional step of, let's call it, additional outreach and research that we as the IFRS Foundation staff are doing to help ISSB facilitate timely development of the taxonomy following fully the IFRS Foundation due process. So we have on the next slide a list of these 9 fundamental matters. And whilst I can try giving you a little bit an overview on each of those, Owen is much, much better in doing that. So I think this is a good time for me to hand over to you, Owen, to run us through to the fundamental matters we considered in developing the staff draft of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy.
Thank you, Aida. So I'll walk slowly through these various questions that we asked in the request for feedback. The first question that we looked for feedback on was how should we prepare and manage the taxonomy representation of the ISSB standards? What we wanted to understand was how the basic technical structure of the taxonomy might possibly impact practical use and electronic reporting in various jurisdictions. We wanted to consider how it would affect jurisdictions that have or haven't adopted IFRS accounting standards, that have or do not yet have widespread digital financial reporting, that use or do not use IFRS accounting taxonomy as the basis of their digital reporting, and that will adopt the IFRS standards as they are, or use them as a foundational baseline for more extensive local requirements. Additionally, and fundamentally, we have 2 separate boards approving 2 sets of standards, which makes certain arrangements more practical. So taking all these factors into account, what we illustrated in the staff draft taxonomy is what we think is the crucial first decision, to separate the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy from the IFRS Accounting Taxonomy and package each as an independent component. That enables the Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy to be used together with the Accounting Taxonomy, but also alongside other accounting taxonomies in jurisdictions that adopt ISSB standards but don't use the IFRS accounting taxonomy, or don't use the IFRS accounting standards. We also wanted to design the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy so that it could potentially be used as a building block in jurisdictions that go beyond the baseline requirements of the ISSB standards. Jurisdictions can address their additional disclosure requirements through a specific top-up taxonomy, allowing for tagging of those additional requirements, while the foundational parts of the disclosures would still be tagged identically across all jurisdictions, and so easily used and compared globally. The next thing we wanted to discuss was the taxonomy layout. And what is the purpose of a taxonomy layout? It addresses how items within the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy will be presented to promote ease of navigation and ease of use of the taxonomy for preparers of digital financial information. Effective grouping of the items within a taxonomy helps preparers navigate, understand and use the taxonomy, which facilitates efficient digital consumption of financial information. These presentation groups are not intended to dictate how preparers should prepare their financial reports, but rather are intended to promote ease of navigation and understandability of the taxonomy to help people to find the right taxonomy item to use to tag a piece of their report or to find the data they are interested in. Basic layout of sustainability-related financial information is expected to vary more than the basic layout of financial information, with different preparers choosing to arrange their reporting along different lines. Because of this, the staff recommended that items within the taxonomy should be grouped into 2 presentation groups to assist preparers in finding the appropriate items. The first grouping we looked at is by standard, where items are grouped based on the draft sustainability disclosure standard to which they apply. That would be consistent with the grouping of elements in the existing IFRS accounting taxonomy, where elements for new or amended standards are organised in the presentation group to which that standard relates. This presentation grouping would aid preparers who may report the sustainability-related financial information in the sequence of the disclosure standards, or simply think about their reporting from that perspective. The second grouping we proposed was the same items grouped instead based on the 4 aspects of core content that preparers may be familiar with from TCFD: governance, strategy, risk management, and targets and metrics. This grouping would bring together the requirements from all IFRS disclosure standards, sustainability disclosure standards, viewing them instead by these 4 aspects of core content. That could aid any preparers who might organise their sustainability-related financial disclosures to address each of the core content aspects in turn. The staff have also recommended a third grouping containing the industry-based metrics, which would not be in the other two groupings, organised by industry. This is expected to reflect reporting practice, where these more detailed disclosures are often provided in a distinct section of the report. We also work closely with the SASB team throughout the development of our staff draft taxonomy to ensure it's consistent with the SASB taxonomy that preceded it. The next issue we discussed was narrative information and the appropriate degree of detail for it. Investors use narrative information differently than numeric information. Numbers are often directly comparable between companies and periods, and consequently it's often useful to capture each reported number separately. For example, an entity's profit or loss for the year. But in contrast, narrative information often needs to be read in context and can be less directly comparable than numerical information. Because of this, larger pieces of text covering topics in a consistent way might be more useful than the smallest possible piece of information. Ultimately, the question is, at what degree of detail should we expect preparers to identify specific items of information within their general purpose financial statements? This is a balancing act in finding the right trade-off between effort required by preparers to tag their reports and the usefulness of that information to the users of the disclosures. Items that are too broad in the information they capture will lead to less useful pieces of information, whereas items that are too narrow and specific may lead to users needing to query multiple items and piece things together to find any useful information, and can impose a lot of effort on preparers when tagging their reports. Our objective was to create distinct items for narrative information when the information was expected to be separately understandable to users and to be easily identified for tagging. To meet this objective, the staff recommended creating items corresponding to the proposed requirements in each sub-paragraph of the standards, because they typically resulted in distinct and coherent disclosures. We also recommended creating items corresponding to the paragraphs that reflect a whole disclosure objective or a whole core content aspect. These would capture any remaining information not reflected in specific subparagraphs. As noted, this is a balancing act, and we would greatly appreciate feedback from both preparers and users of sustainability disclosures on whether we are broadly striking the right balance in our proposal. Some narrative disclosures, such as when the disclosure essentially indicates a categorical yes or no answer or a choice from a specific list of options, are more similar to numeric information in that they are directly comparable between entities and across periods. If such data were actually provided by preparers in their digital reporting in a categorical format, by which I mean essentially as multiple choice, rather than just as text, primary users would be able to quickly search databases for information, compare across different companies, and compare the same company across periods, without needing to interpret the textual disclosures of each entity. On the next slide, we have some examples of categorical items that we've proposed including in the taxonomy. We've suggested some Boolean items to be used where answers for tagging are either true or false, and enumeration type items which allow a fixed list of predetermined answers. The ISSB has incorporated the climate-related disclosure requirements of the SASB standards into the S2 Climate-Related Disclosures Exposure Draft. Industry-based disclosure requirements identify, measure, and disclose information related to significant climate-related risks and opportunities associated with particular industries. In the SASB standards, these industry-based metrics were grouped by sector, by industry, and then by disclosure topic, and each metric was ascribed a resulting code which linked all of those to the metric. Around this time last year, SASB published a taxonomy representing the reporting requirements in the SASB standards. Their taxonomy closely followed the layout of their standards. This structure made the process of searching for the correct item to tag related disclosures efficient and clear for preparers. Now, there is a strong continuity between the SASB standards and ISSB's S2 exposure draft. The S2 industry-based requirements are closely derived from the SASB standards and follow exactly the same structure and coding. Given this, the approach we recommended in the staff draft taxonomy was to leverage the work previously done on the SASB taxonomy, which we worked closely with the SASB staff to incorporate into our taxonomy. We used identical names for equivalent items and followed a similar presentation of those items in the taxonomy. We need to propose some changes compared to the SASB taxonomy in order to align with the draft IFRS S2 requirements. That included making some changes, some metrics more internationally applicable, and including metrics for disclosure about financial emissions. As a result, however, the two taxonomies are very similar. The next issue that we discussed was connected information. The General Requirements Exposure Draft requires entities to describe the relationships between pieces of information, either within the sustainability disclosures or between sustainability and financial disclosures. For example, where the disclosure of use of scarce natural resources will be related to the risk of natural resource shortages and on to potential financial impacts in, for example, loss of sales or changes in prices. The staff has not so far recommended a specific method of capturing these connections in digital form, other than the simple block tagging of the narrative information. In the request for feedback, we ask if other, more specific digital tools should perhaps be used to improve the digital accessibility of this information, describing connections between related disclosures. What use might the consumers of sustainability disclosures wish to make of these connections, for example, and what information would need to be captured about them to facilitate these uses? Similarly, we discussed cross-referencing. The General Requirements Exposure Draft permits a preparer to include information by way of cross-reference to another report, where this information forms part of the complete set of sustainability-related financial disclosures. Could there perhaps be a risk that the information in that other report might not be tagged, and thus that the digital representation of the sustainability report could be incomplete? Although we considered this topic, for now, we recommended that requirements related to cross-references should not be explicitly modelled in the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy, partly because no suitable taxonomy-level modelling approach was identified to address all the concerns on this topic. Instead, we think this is an area that will depend on how reporting regimes and jurisdictions choose to handle questions about cross-references and how they are allowed, and if and how such reference documents should be submitted as part of a digital financial reporting. As with all of the topics we've discussed, this is an area where we're looking for your thoughts, opinions, and ideas in order to develop the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy and more generally develop a digital financial reporting process for sustainability disclosures that works the best it can for everyone involved in the process, regulators, preparers, and users of information alike. On that note, I'll now hand over back to Ravi to discuss how you could help shape the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy and the work of the ISSB more generally.
Great job, Owen, and thanks ever so much. So let's talk about how you can get involved in the development of the Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy and shape the future of digital general purpose financial reporting. Reflecting the ISSB's desire to develop a digital reporting strategy from the start, the staff published a staff request for feedback to obtain feedback that will inform the development of a future proposed IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy. That is what my colleagues Aida and Owen just took you through. The proposed taxonomy will be formally consulted on in accordance with the IFRS Foundation due process. The aim is to publish the proposed taxonomy for public consultation shortly after the ISSB issues its standards. The staff recommendations focus on fundamental matters that need to be considered early to enable the ISSB to publish the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy on a timely basis. The staff consultation documents have therefore not been approved by the ISSB. They do not constitute an exposure draft or all proposed taxonomy and are not due process documents. So I just wanted to reiterate what I did mention a moment ago. The ISSB will consider publishing a formal exposure draft on the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy following the finalisation of the IFRS S1 and S2 standards. And following the ISSB's first meeting, which took place in July, you can participate in forthcoming meetings which are taking place in September. The meeting papers have been published and currently on the website, so do take a look because quite a lot of effort has been put into them. Meeting summaries will then be available on or after the 26th of September. The meeting will be broadcast live and can be observed online. Details of the September meeting and all future meetings will be published in our events calendar in the link on the screen. And that's it. So it's now time for questions. So Aida, I'll hand over to you, and perhaps you can tackle questions.
Thanks, Ravi. And if you don't mind staying online for a bit, because we have quite a lot of questions here, and I think some might be relevant to you. So let's start with a question from a participant who said, so if the feedback we receive is not to develop a taxonomy, is that a possible way forward, or is ISSB going to develop a digital taxonomy regardless? Ravi, do you want to take this?
Yeah, of course. A very good question. Well, we're very much governed by the Due Process Handbook, and the proposed taxonomy will be published for public consultation in accordance with the IFRS Foundation Due Process Handbook. It really is up to the discretion of the ISSB members as to how long that should take, but the ISSB expects to publish the proposed IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy for public consultation shortly after we issue our first standards or first final IFRS disclosure standard. So hopefully that's helpful.
Indeed, thank you very much, Ravi. And I also hope our participants, because I think this question came quite early, maybe before Jatin, you gave your very persuasive presentation on the benefits and usefulness of digital reporting, which hopefully was convincing that why developing taxonomy is a good idea and why it will be helpful for our stakeholders. Similar question, Owen, has come in and asking, are stakeholders going to have to pay to access the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy and Xbrl, or is that resource provided for free?
So yes, the ISSB IFRS Sustainability Taxonomy will be provided for use for free, and the underlying Xbrl specifications are free to use as well.
That is fantastic news, and that really supports the mission of the IFRS Foundation, doesn't it, to work in the public interest. Yeah, that is very good, and thank you for asking that question. We have quite a few more questions here. So let me pick one on relationship with other standard setters and their taxonomy. So Owen, how is that meant to work?
So the approach that we've been taking is that the ISSB standards are intended to be a global baseline, that there is expectation that jurisdictions may want to ask for requirements that add on top of that. And so we've intended to build taxonomy to support that kind of use. The happy path approach would be that the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy would form a core, and that jurisdictions, if they want to go beyond the ISSB standards, would add top-up taxonomies to work alongside that to model their extra parts. We have been working alongside a variety of jurisdictions, partly through the ISSB's jurisdictional working group, to try and lay the path for that as a possibility. We've had technical level conversations with various jurisdictions as well. Failing, if that kind of approach, if the standards are not aligned in that way, we will also attempt to work with jurisdictions to try and align the taxonomies as much as possible as far as they will go.
Thank you, Owen. So does this mean that the jurisdictions don't need to align and taxonomy is going to solve that and create interoperability?
So unfortunately, the taxonomies can only go so far in helping with interoperability. If the standards are aligned such that the definitions being used for things are the same, if the basic core requirements are the same, then the taxonomies and digital reporting can work very well. It can allow flexibility in terms of top-ups, but allowing the core parts to be the same information and allowing for global comparability. Unfortunately, if the standards are not interoperable, taxonomies can't really solve that problem. They can't paper over it.
Thank you so much, Owen, and that's so important to highlight, isn't it? Because there's almost a danger of doing more harm than good if taxonomy is used to basically make some very different concept look similar. So yeah. It's and it also goes back to the basics that the taxonomy that is being developed here is very much based on the requirements in the standards. It's not based on, you know, what reports are out there, no matter the underlying requirements. So that is really intended to work with what ISSB sets out in the final, in its S1 and S2 and all the future standards. So we have quite a lot more questions here. I will try to go through them as they come through. So there's one about use of ESG disclosures in Xbrl format, and do we have a complete list of exchanges who are sharing sustainability-related disclosures in Xbrl? And maybe I'll just pick up on this one. So this is an area that we are researching, and we have a colleague who is not with us in the webinar today, but part of his role is to work with our stakeholders, with the ecosystem partners, including the regulators and exchanges. And we are, you know, on one hand collecting information, and on the other hand also discussing with them how they plan adoption, because we know quite a few are in the process of thinking of implementing this, even if that has not happened today. So I would just say stay tuned on that one, and we will certainly plan to share more information as things get more settled. So there's one question on kind of taxonomy going forward and how the updates might work for the taxonomy, how we will update that. I don't know, Owen, do you want to take this one as well and say what is our process for updating the taxonomies in general? Maybe that's helpful to share.
Yeah, so at the moment we're working on the basis that the ISSB due process for taxonomy update will be the same as the ISSB's due process. That involves a yearly update cycle, where we publish an updated taxonomy every year that incorporates any changes to the standards that have occurred during that year. The updated taxonomies go through the same kind of due process that we're describing for the initial release of the taxonomy. We will develop a proposed update. The ISSB will review. The ISSB will approve that proposal. There'll be a public comment period on it. We will then take account of the public comments to produce a final taxonomy update, which again the ISSB will approve, and we will intend to publish an update on an annual cycle. Now, obviously, at the beginning periods, it's possible that might be adjusted depending on the ISSB's publication cycle for standards, but that's our initial assumption at this point.
Thank you, Owen, and maybe also useful to touch on our common practice review process that we also have in the due process for the taxonomy, and this envisages after a period of time a standard has been implemented to review common practice for reporting and identify any common disclosures that are frequently provided by companies, but for which we don't have a specific element in the taxonomy because, for example, that is not specifically required, or there is no such example in the standard and accompanying materials based on which taxonomy is developed. So we have a process of reviewing that and updating taxonomy for those elements. And the process there in the due process sense is a little bit different in that it is we work very closely with the taxonomy consultative group on that, and it does not require a formal approval of the ISSB to introduce these additional elements, but it is of course all done in close cooperation. So that is a little bit about the future process and the next step. We have quite a lot more questions here, so I will carry on. So maybe one for you, Jatin. There's been lots of talk about the green taxonomies, and sometimes people ask, is green taxonomy equivalent of what we are doing, or is there something else? Could you maybe just clarify these different terms that are floating around and their uses?
Sure, thanks, Aida. So the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy is not the same as a green taxonomy. As I mentioned earlier, a taxonomy is just any structure for classifying information. There's even taxonomies for classifying species of animal and plant, and so it can be any type of taxonomy. And so where green taxonomies are used to categorize or classify environmentally sustainable activities, our taxonomy, the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy, is used to categorize or classify disclosure requirements and financial data points, which can then be used to tag sustainably related financial information. So the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy is not a green taxonomy, but rather a taxonomy for classifying financial data points.
Thank you so much, Jatin, for clarifying that. And so we sometimes use a shorthand of digital taxonomy, don't we, just to make sure it is clear that it is not a green taxonomy we are talking about. So we're not defining anything. We are simply providing elements for concepts that are already defined or will be already defined in S1 and S2. So let me just have one for you, Ravi, I think, and the question is about relationship with the SASB standards, and it is, what is the biggest difference between the SASB standards and the standards that the ISSB is developing?
Yeah, of course, very good question. So as some of my colleagues have mentioned a moment ago, from a S2 climate perspective, there is ultimately very little difference between the climate SASB metrics and those which are detailed within Appendix 2 of S2. Going forward, there is a discussion to be had from ISSB members on what the future priorities of the ISSB should be. And to that, there will be an agenda priority consultation, which will request which is a request for information from stakeholders on what those next steps should be. And part of those next steps will detail next steps on the SASB standards projects as well. So I would very much keep my eyes peeled out for that, for when that comes out, and very much do feed into that process going forward.
Busy days indeed. Thank you so much, Ravi, for clarifying that. So we have some technical questions, and when it comes to technical questions, Owen, I'm gonna go straight to you. And this is on one of our favorite topics. And I say that both ways, favorite and quite tricky topics, which is the tagging of the narrative information. And the question is, how would this become machine readable, or maybe just explain our whole thinking about tagging of the narratives and different things we have considered to shine some light on this topic.
Okay, so there are probably two aspects to this. The first is the simple tagging of the text and what benefit that brings. And one of those is that because the sort of format and layout of a sustainability report is quite flexible, the ISSB standards don't actually specify how you must present, just the kind of content that must be in there. There is benefit merely in tagging which part of your document is supposed to be addressing which of the ISSB requirements, to allow people more quickly to be able to find that information within the document, to be able to find that information across many different reports on a more comparable basis. and simply finding the right kind of granularity and tagging the right chunks of information that are a bit more comparable between documents can both help people who are reading the documents, but also things like machine learning and sentiment analysis to be able to be applied to those documents without having to wade through the vast quantity of a text that is a report, most of which may not be relevant for the particular topic people are looking at. So that helps the information be machine readable in itself. The other thing we've added into the taxonomy, the staff draft, and they've asked questions about in requests for feedback, is the idea of these categorical elements, where we ask people essentially to boil down the meaning of their text to what precise answer to the requirements of the standards is it providing, which more directly makes information machine readable because it gives you a much more consumable piece of information rather than a paragraph or 2 paragraphs of text in what could be any language in the world. You have specifically the information, is it this case or that case? So those are the 2 aspects where the taxonomy helps narrative information be machine readable and be more usable in things like models or artificial intelligence sort of situations.
Thank you so much, Owen. And this is quite important area to get right, because it's a balancing act in finding the kind of level of detail that is separately understandable for users, but not go in too much detail, because then we risk putting too much burden on the companies to tag same disclosures multiple times, because what we also want to do, we would have so-called a block nested tagging, where companies would have to tag a higher and a lower concept. So it is real balancing act here, and one we really want to get right, because once this taxonomy is out, our aim is that the individual jurisdictions that apply ISSB standards would also apply the taxonomy in full in the same, that would also include the taxonomy for narrative reporting, so that they wouldn't diverge from the level of detail that we have set out, which would then ultimately help investors compare these disclosures regardless of which jurisdiction the company is coming from that has provided them. So this is very, very important part, and is something that we perhaps haven't spent an awful amount of time in when developing IFRS accounting taxonomy, simply because it is less of an issue there, whereas there's much more narrative disclosures here. So we are putting a lot of focus on this thing. So there's a few more technical questions, and here is one for you, Jatin. So there's a question: what will the digital taxonomy look like? What is it we are talking about here? Do you want to run us through that?
Yes, thanks, Aida. That's an interesting question, because if you look at it from one perspective, there's a multiple perspectives, but if you look at it from one perspective, the digital taxonomy is essentially it's a file, it's an XML file or a document that contains all the codes of the various items and elements that we have coded into the taxonomy. But often that is difficult for a human to read and to understand what elements, how they fit together, where they come from, how they reference the standards. And so from our perspective, what a taxonomy would look like from a human readable perspective is we provide both a PDF version and an Excel version, which is an illustrated version of what the taxonomy would look like. And in that illustrated version, it shows elements that we've created per the standards, which have been grouped into presentation groups. And in some cases, even a hierarchical sort of link is shown where certain elements fall under another disclosure requirement. And so that is presented in both PDF and Excel format. And when we've provided those illustrative formats, we have, as Owen mentioned earlier, tried to provide 2 different views. So we've grouped the elements into 2 different presentation groups. One is by standard, because we believe that, or it's possible that when a preparer is preparing their sustainability disclosures, they may prepare it by standard, or they may prepare it by aspect of core content. So by providing those two views, we're hoping that we can provide a robust sort of a navigation tool for preparers to find the correct elements when they're tagging their taxonomy. So from a human readable perspective, what a taxonomy would look like to us is it would look sort of in elements presented in their presentation groups, either by a standard or by aspect of core content.
Thank you so much.
Your question.
Thank you so much, Jatin, for that. So we cater for humans and machines as well. And maybe also useful to note that once we have a final taxonomy, that this will also be available in what we call Standards Navigator, which is basically a place on the IFRS website where you can access and read the standards. So there will be a version of the standard. There will be a tick, is that right, Owen, where you can say add taxonomy layer, and when you click that tick, then you view the standard. So every paragraph on the standard that you will see the list of taxonomy elements that were created that relate to that particular paragraph. So that is again another a kind of human readable way to observe and identify what elements have been created from each particular requirement that will be in the standards. So with that, just coming back to a bit of question on the process and working together with the software providers. There was a question maybe for you, Owen. Are we working together with the software providers? What are they doing in relation to sustainability disclosure taxonomy that will be coming? Can you give us a little bit color on that?
So obviously one of the main purposes of publishing the staff draft taxonomy was to provide a sort of concrete example for software providers to work with, to be able to see what we were planning on providing and how it would work. The taxonomy we're producing, the Xbrl taxonomy we're producing, is very much in the same format as those that already exist that have been produced by the IFRS Foundation for the accounting side, or for example, that are used by the SEC in the US that form the basis of ESEF reporting in the EU, and they're sort of widely used. It's the same kind of structure and format. So the same software that works for those should be fairly easily adaptable. With providing the concrete Xbrl taxonomy example in the staff draft, we've given software providers a fairly fast start on looking at any tweaks they might need to use. Also, we're looking for their feedback as part of the consultation process on that taxonomy to help us get involved. Obviously, when we produce the proposed taxonomy and have the consultation period on that, we will probably also get involved in an outreach process. Specifically, exactly. Then we have been involved in a little bit of outreach now with various software providers to try and get the feedback on whether things and what things will work and how they can adapt their software.
Because we know that some of them have actually already uploaded the staff draft of the taxonomy.
For example, the staff draft taxonomy is already available on various software providers. Taxonomy viewing software, it works directly in there without them having to make any changes at all because it's a standard Xbrl taxonomy.
Thank you so much. And we have 2 minutes left, and I will try to cover 2 more questions. This is not all the questions we have received, so my apologies, but I'll try 2 more. One for you, Owen, and one for you, Ravi. So one is, who will do the tagging? Do we have machines ready to do the tagging, Owen, or is it still human effort going to be involved with tagging sustainability related to financial disclosures?
I think it will still be humans involved in the process. Lots of software that's out there at the moment that helps people tag their accounting has sort of a bit of artificial intelligence or machine assistance to help roll over taggings from previous years or to guess what the tagging should be. But ultimately, there needs to be a person involved in the process, because what the preparer is doing at that step is making sure that they input their knowledge of their own reports in there to make sure that the right tags, the right things are applied to the right parts of their document, so that information is most useful to the consumers of it. You as a preparer of your document know what you intended each section to represent and to what kind of parts of the standard you intended them to address, and that's really that added information that you're providing when you do the tagging.
Thank you so much, Owen. So we are, maybe in the future the answer will be different, right? But at the moment,
more machine assisted than machine handled, I think.
Okay. So we have quite a few questions left, Ravi, and here I am wondering which ones to ask you. But let's focus on sharing and what is the maybe another version of the questions Jatin answered earlier, but it's very important, I think, to clarify. So the question is, does the IFRS Foundation intend to share Xbrl format with corporates?
Yes, yes to that question. Considering that we've only got a short amount of time, it's a free resource, and it can be used by corporates to do the necessary tagging once we've been through the process of due process. So that's it, Ada. I'm going to hand back over to you, bearing in mind time.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you taking time out today to listen to us, and we hope that many of you will continue to engage either by sending us a comment letter on the staff draft or engaging later when the ISSB issues published proposed taxonomy. And if you really wanted questions answered that we haven't had that chance to answer this morning, of course, you can join us again this afternoon, and I will recognize your questions and I'll make sure we answer them then. But with that, I wish you all a wonderful day and thank you again for joining us. Bye.